Welcome. My name is Amy Dorman, and I am a doctoral student in the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota. I will be presenting this module titled The Co-Occurrence of Intimate Partner Violence and Child Maltreatment. I am presenting this module based on a project being conducted by Dr. Lynette Renner, who is a professor in the School of Social Work, and Jake Otis, who is also a doctoral student in the School of Social Work. This module is the first of two modules we created to highlight the connection between intimate partner violence and child maltreatment, with a focus on people who use violence. There are two learning objectives for this module. First, by viewing this module, we expect the audience to have a better understanding of the co-occurrence of intimate partner violence and child maltreatment. This includes increased knowledge of intimate partner violence and child maltreatment separately, as well as the co-occurrence of these two forms of abuse. Second, we expect the audience to increase their knowledge of evidence-based practices for cases involving the co-occurrence of child maltreatment and intimate partner violence. The second module centers on the goals, structure, and effectiveness of batterer intervention programs and how these interventions are important to child welfare needs and goals. We hope that you also view that module. As we begin, it is important to provide a brief overview of intimate partner violence and child maltreatment, including the definitions used in this module, national statistics, and outcomes across the lifespan for the entire family system. In this module, we use the term intimate partner violence, or IPV. IPV is similar to, but not synonymous with, domestic violence, and is the term most often used to refer to violence between adults in partnered relationships. The CDC defines intimate partner violence as abuse or aggression that can take the form of physical, sexual, psychological violence, and/or stalking, and occurs within a romantic relationship. Intimate partners can be current or former partners. It is important to note that this definition may vary slightly from state statute definitions. Other forms of IPV include verbal abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, and coercive control. The National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey from the CDC indicated that approximately 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men in the United States have experienced contact sexual violence, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner during their lifetime, and reported some form of IPV-related impact, including injury, needing medical care, needing help from law enforcement or an advocacy agency, and/or missing work. Over 43 million women have reported experiencing psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime, including verbal and behavioral acts intended to humiliate, criticize, intimidate, and threaten. Women who identify as Black or Native American experience the highest rates of IPV in the United States, and women who identify as lesbian, bisexual, and transgender are also at an elevated risk for violence. 1 in 5 homicides in the United States are at the hands of a current or former intimate partner, and women are more likely to die from IPV. A 2017 exploration of National Violent Death Reporting System data found that IPV was a precipitating circumstance in approximately 41.9% of homicides among females, compared to just 7.3% of homicides among males. Data from Minnesota are in line with national statistics and show that 1 in 4 women report physical violence from an intimate partner during their lifetime. Between 2016 and 2018, women accounted for 83% of IPV-related emergency department visits and hospitalizations in Minnesota. From 2014 to 2017, 116 children lost their mothers to intimate partner homicide. The pandemic brought heightened risk for families as stay-at-home orders made it more difficult for families to escape abusive situations and seek assistance. Shelters faced resource and staffing shortages, and economic and environmental stressors were at a high. During the pandemic, domestic violence advocates sounded the alarm as intimate partner homicide numbers rose in Minnesota. In 2020, intimate partner homicides increased by 40%, reaching a 5-year high for the state. IPV is associated with other forms of violence, including child maltreatment, both of which are related to serious health issues and economic consequences for individuals, families, and whole communities. In addition to detrimental chronic physical and mental health conditions affecting the heart, digestive, and reproductive systems, and depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, Individuals who experience IPV are at higher risk for engaging in substance use and suicidal behaviors. The lifetime economic costs of IPV to society are estimated at $3.6 trillion, including medical costs, lost productivity, and legal system costs. The cost of IPV over a female victim's lifetime is estimated to exceed $100,000. The CDC defines child maltreatment as including all types of abuse and neglect against a child under the age of 18 by a parent, caregiver, or another person in a custodial role, such as a religious leader, a coach, or a teacher, that results in harm, the potential for harm, or a threat of harm to a child. The four most common types of maltreatment are physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. Again, we emphasize that this definition may vary from definitions in state statute. Data from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services show that nationally, at least 1 in 7 children in the U.S. have experienced child maltreatment in the last year. Like IPV, child maltreatment is often underreported and underrepresented, so rates of abuse and neglect are likely higher than what is known to various formal agencies. In Minnesota in 2019, 6,780 children were found to be victims of maltreatment, and 17 children lost their lives due to child maltreatment. Minnesota's Child Maltreatment Report from the Minnesota Department of Human Services showed that almost 90,000 cases of child maltreatment were reported to child protection agencies in 2019. More than 9 out of every 10 reports were screened out as they did not meet the statutory threshold for maltreatment. American Indian children were approximately 5 times more likely to be involved in a completed child maltreatment assessment or investigation compared to their white counterparts. Child maltreatment can have immense and debilitating long-term impacts on all areas of child development, including physical and mental health, behavioral, cognitive, and social functioning, and subsequently opportunity, and overall well-being over the lifespan. The economic costs to society of child maltreatment are significant and rival costs of other major public health issues such as type 2 diabetes and strokes. In 2015, the total lifetime economic burden associated with child abuse and neglect in the United States was approximately $428 billion. An estimated 16% of children are exposed to psychological or emotional IPV, and 17.9% are exposed to physical IPV. Exposure to IPV is often recognized by practitioners and researchers as a form of child maltreatment, although it is only recognized as a form of maltreatment in half of the states in the U.S. Children who are exposed to IPV may experience low self-esteem, social withdrawal, depression, and anxiety, and may be more likely to engage in aggressive, violent, and delinquent behavior. Millions of children are harmed by adult IPV, and researchers have documented strong linkages between IPV and other forms of child abuse and neglect. For example, several researchers have documented that IPV and child physical abuse co-occur in 30 to 60% of families where IPV takes place. Children residing in a home where IPV occurs are at an increased risk for child maltreatment. IPV and child maltreatment share similar consequences for individuals across the lifespan, including physical injury, chronic mental and physical health issues, higher risk for substance use, reduced opportunities and well-being, and even death. Specifically, childhood exposure to IPV increases the risk of future violence victimization and perpetration, sexually transmitted infections, delayed brain development, lower educational attainment, and limited employment opportunities. IPV and child maltreatment both have negative effects on communities, including substantial economic burden, lack of safety, and long-term emotional trauma from losing community members to violence. Historically, agency responses to the co-occurrence of IPV and child maltreatment have been siloed, creating separate systems for children and adults who experience or use violence. This resulted in child maltreatment being the focus of the child welfare system, women who experienced IPV being served by domestic violence agencies, and men who used violence being served through the criminal justice system. Intervention efforts primarily focus on children and adults who experience abuse and often exclude the person who used violence. There have also been tensions between these family-serving systems. In 1999, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges published recommendations that providers and dependency courts should follow as they respond to families experiencing child maltreatment and IPV. Yet, ever since the Green Book was published, systems have grappled with how to best meet the needs of individuals and families who experience co-occurring violence. Despite the framework provided by the Green Book Initiative, there continue to be missing linkages between agencies and support organizations that may ultimately become involved to ensure the safety of children and caregivers in cases involving the co-occurrence of IPV and child maltreatment. System connection in every capacity of IPV work is limited. Child welfare and IPV service organization connections, medical and legal partnerships, and criminal justice and IPV service agency connections continue to fall short of what is needed to adequately address the co-occurrence of child maltreatment and IPV. These system shortcomings are further impacted by limited knowledge of and relationships with domestic violence shelters and advocacy organizations, intervention programs, and culturally specific organizations within child protection systems. As we move into discussing best practices for caseworkers and organizations, there are several considerations that will be explored in more depth throughout the remainder of this module. First and foremost, increasing understanding of IPV as a pattern of abuse, coercion, and control is invaluable to being able to support persons who experience IPV and their children, and to help keep families safe. Shifting the perspective of child welfare workers from a failure to protect mentality, or putting the onus on the caregiver who experienced abuse for not protecting their child instead of holding the person who engages in abuse accountable for creating a violent environment, in cases with co-occurrence of IPV and child maltreatment is essential. Caseworkers should appropriately shift responsibility to people who use violence and simultaneously work to hold them accountable and engage in intervention services. Caseworkers should make every effort to keep a child in the care of the person who experienced IPV as long as it is safe to do so. This involves partnering with the person who experienced IPV to better understand what strategies they are currently using to keep themselves and their children safe. An adult who experiences IPV knows their situation best and is best equipped to make the safest decisions for themselves and their families, in partnership with external support when necessary. Partnering with persons who experienced IPV and other caregivers often involves practicing cultural humility and approaching all situations with curiosity, basing decisions off of careful questioning and not assumption of needs. Understanding the background and cultural context of each person in the case and identifying the unique strengths and needs based on context can help caseworkers and persons who experienced IPV create a holistic plan to keep their families safe and to help their families heal. Building relationships with culturally specific organizations can help caseworkers provide community-based options for holistic and sensitive care and security. Increasing coordination across child protection agencies, law enforcement and legal systems, domestic violence support services, and other community organizations is important for putting together a more complete picture of each family's situation. These system collaborations also provide interventions and services that can best meet the needs of individuals and the family. The next few slides will present best practices for caseworkers throughout the assessment and case management process. Later, we will also look at best practices at the organizational level. These practices are not an exhaustive list and should be considered in addition to current agency and state guidelines. It is important for caseworkers to routinely inquire about IPV occurrence in initial assessment interviews with every adult member, whether or not there are allegations against a family member, and whether or not the person who used violence lives in the home. Researchers have found that inquiries about IPV are sporadic and inconsistent within several entry points to care, including child protective service agencies. It is important that child protection workers use brief, evidence-based screening tools to determine the occurrence of IPV. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force recommends using one of 6 screening tools which have the sensitivity and specificity needed to screen for IPV. The HARK and HIT screening tools are both good examples of 4-item, behaviorally specific, evidence-based screening tools for IPV. Reported child maltreatment by someone who allegedly uses violence against an intimate partner or caregiver are mandated reports. Allegations of child maltreatment that co-occurs with IPV must be made against the person who used violence, not against the person experiencing IPV. Intake staff should identify whether or how children were directly involved in or a target of any acts of abuse. These details will help the caseworker understand if a reported incident alleges a statutory violation. Formal interviews should not take place at the initial screening. IPV is complex, and people who experience violence may not be ready to disclose, may deny incidents of abuse, and/or may defend the person who used violence for a variety of reasons. Caseworkers should instead focus on partnering with the person who experienced IPV to secure immediate safety and basic needs through safety planning and referrals to IPV advocates. Children's safety is directly linked to the safety of their parents. Therefore, it is essential to connect the person who experienced IPV to local IPV programs and other basic needs supports that can help increase safety and stability for the person who experienced IPV and their children. The safety planning process should be completed in full collaboration with the person who experienced IPV. They know their situation best and are best equipped to know what would be most helpful to keep their family safe. Part of this process is engaging with the person who experienced IPV to identify the ways they have worked to protect themselves and their children, what has worked and what has not. This helps to build off existing formal and informal strategies that are working to build a safety plan going forward, including who to call, where to go, and what to do if a situation turns violent. It is also important to discuss preparing certain personal items the person who experienced IPV may need to bring with them if fleeing a violent situation, including birth certificates, immigration documents, banking information, keys, and a written list of contact information. It is important to understand that a person who experienced IPV is often at highest risk of violence when they are attempting to leave their abusive partner. This fear of harm could be one reason that some people who experience IPV are hesitant to or choose not to leave their partners. At times, staying in the relationship may be the safest option for the person who experienced IPV and their children. Coordinating safety planning with staff from an IPV program and other relevant agencies can help make this transition safer, should it become necessary. Finally, while in some circumstances filing for an Order for Protection, or OFP, or Harassment and Restraining Order, or HRO, can be an important protective measure, it is critical that caseworkers never mandate someone who experienced IPV to file for an Order for Protection or Harassment Restraining Order as part of the safety plan or terms of compliance to a case plan. Not all persons who experience IPV are eligible to apply for a protection order. Judges may not grant the order, and filing for an order can increase the risk of violence rather than make the family safer. In cases involving the co-occurrence of IPV and child maltreatment, interviews with the involved parents or caregivers should always be conducted separately and privately. This can help protect against interviews causing retaliatory violence and can help the person who experienced IPV feel safer to disclose and discuss the situation. However, it's important to understand that caseworkers do not need to require disclosure from the person who experienced IPV. People who experienced IPV may be reluctant or unwilling to disclose details of the abuse due to fear of retaliation from the person who used violence and/or fear of what may happen to their children if they disclose, including but not limited to physical violence, cutoff from financial resources, isolation from community, instigating child custody battles, abuse or taking of pets, etc. Caseworkers should ask about any specific incidents of violence that have been reported and should also use questions that explore coercive and controlling tactics employed by the person who used violence that could indicate higher risks of violence. Some of these behaviors will be discussed in more detail in the following slides. Caseworkers should also ask about any protective and help-seeking strategies the person who experienced IPV is using in order to build current helpful strategies into a co-created safety plan, which includes encouraging the person who experienced IPV to connect with an IPV or domestic violence advocate. Once connected, the caseworker should maintain communication with the advocate in order to collaborate most effectively in connecting the person who experienced IPV with resources, while maintaining confidentiality based on agency guidelines. Throughout the interview, caseworkers should affirm their role as a partner in keeping the children safe. Caseworkers should also avoid using language that diminishes or hides the role of the person who used violence, such as "they fought" or "they hit each other." This language should be avoided in the interview itself as well as in written records, as mutualizing language can shift responsibility away from the person who used violence and towards the person who experienced IPV, especially as the case may require action from other agencies. It is best practice for caseworkers to prepare for the separate interview with the person who used violence by doing a thorough search of a wide range of records, looking for a pattern of behavior over time. This prepares the caseworker to supplement current allegations with any other documented instances that support the current allegation and/or indicate patterns of behavior which the person who used violence may try to minimize and/or deny in the interview. It is important to note that a lack of criminal record or law enforcement involvement does not mean that violence is not present within the family system. People who experience IPV may have many reasons for not contacting the police or involving the legal system. Going into the interview, caseworkers should understand that there is no definitive profile of someone who uses violence. Some people who use IPV may try to seek information about what the person who experienced IPV disclosed, seek affirmation and sympathy from the caseworker, and/or shift responsibility to the person who experienced IPV, including blaming the person who experienced IPV, the police, or broader systems for the abuse and/or child maltreatment. The goal of the interview is not to get a confession from the person who used violence. Instead, caseworkers should use the interview to assess the attitude of the person who used violence towards their behavior and identify if the person who used violence may be willing to make changes and follow recommendations. Caseworkers should be clear in the interview that abuse is not acceptable and is harmful to children and family functioning. Caseworkers should demonstrate high expectations for parental behavior from the person who used violence and emphasize that abusive behaviors are negative parenting choices that can have long-term adverse impacts on children. When speaking with the person who used violence, it is also critical that caseworkers do not confirm or disclose information from any interviews with the partner or caregiver who experienced violence. Sharing the information disclosed by each partner is not conducive, and it can increase the risk for future violence. Caseworkers should determine whether persons who use violence are a continued safety threat to the person who experienced IPV and/or the children in the home. Indicators of this can be identified in separate interviews, as well as through other means, such as through other documented instances of violence if the family has previously been connected to the system. Some of the behaviors and attitudes that can indicate an increased risk of danger to family members include minimization, denial, external blame, threats, including using a weapon or firearm and/or threatening to commit suicide, stalking behavior, strangulation, and excessive jealousy, ownership, and/or controlling behavior. Caseworkers should develop separate plans for persons who used IPV, persons who experienced IPV, and children where appropriate. For cases involving IPV, it is not appropriate to have joint or family case plans, as persons who use violence must have their own plan centered on accountability for compliance. Case strategies should center safety and stability for all family members and accountability for the person who used violence. Whenever possible, batterer intervention program attendance should be a required part of a case plan for the person who used IPV. Other interventions like psychotherapy, anger management, mental health, or substance use treatment are not effective interventions to address IPV, as they do not address the root causes of abuse, nor do they provide the necessary tools to change these behaviors and promote accountability for abuse. As these interventions can be helpful in targeting tangential issues that can impact the severity and/or frequency of violence and other areas of family well-being, they should be considered in addition to, not in lieu of, batterer intervention program participation. Coordination with other systems, including law enforcement and court systems, may be a necessary part of the case plan for the person who used IPV to ensure accountability. Clear expectations should be established. The person who used violence must comply with all parts of the case plan or face consequences, including legal consequences. Caseworkers should thoroughly document case files in cases with co-occurrence of IPV and child maltreatment. Cases involving IPV can display a pattern of escalating abuse over time, making it important that documentation of all known incidences be available to other agencies that may become involved. The following slide presents organizational strategies that can enhance best practices for cases involving the co-occurrence of IPV and child maltreatment, including promoting professional well-being among caseworkers and building relationships with other organizations and agencies. Well-being has a direct impact on how well caseworkers are able to approach a case that involves the co-occurrence of IPV and child maltreatment in a trauma-informed way. Frustration with people who experience IPV can stem from a lack of knowledge and training around IPV, in addition to stress, burnout, and secondary and/or personal histories of trauma that the caseworker themselves may be experiencing. Increasing knowledge of and access to self-care practices and modeling these practices can help to foster an organizational culture that can help support caseworkers in utilizing trauma-informed practices in these cases. Frustration towards the person who experienced IPV can also arise from a limited understanding that leaving an abusive relationship can be extremely dangerous and may not be the safest option for the person who experienced IPV or their children. Frustration that the person who experienced IPV does not leave an unsafe relationship can result in victim blaming, or blaming the person who experienced violence, which can impact the decision-making of the caseworker, including an increase in recommending out-of-home placement of children. Caseworker biases towards the race and/or cultural background of the person who experienced IPV and/or the person who used IPV can also impact the decision to place a child in out-of-home care. Organizations can work to mitigate these frustrations and biases by providing specialized training in IPV and cultural humility for caseworkers. Partnering with IPV or domestic violence programs, culturally specific support organizations, and other agencies like the court system and law enforcement is an important part of creating coordinated case plans that promote safety and stability for families and accountability for people who use violence. Administrators can take an active role in fostering these relationships by enhancing lines of communication and information sharing between organizations, providing all caseworkers with information on relevant service organizations, including culturally specific organizations, and actively and intentionally coordinating community connections between caseworkers and local IPV or domestic violence advocates. Resilience in children who experience and/or witness abuse and trauma is strengthened through an enduring relationship with a supportive caregiver, most often the person who experienced IPV. Therefore, to prevent short and long-term adverse outcomes for children, it is essential to promote the safety of the person who experienced IPV and to prioritize keeping the child in their care whenever possible. To assist in this, caseworkers should shift responsibility to the person who used IPV and use separate interactions and case plans to keep families safe and hold people who use violence accountable. It is important that caseworkers engage with the person who uses violence and direct them to programs geared towards behavioral change. For example, several programs for men who use violence like Caring Dads and Fathers for Change and Batterer Intervention Programs, or BIPs, are available to help men and other people who use violence to transform their attitudes, behavior, and approaches to relationships, including parenting relationships. Organizations can promote best practices for cases involving the co-occurrence of IPV and child maltreatment through providing specialized trainings for caseworkers on IPV and cultural humility, building relationships between external organizations and agencies, and supporting self-care practices among caseworkers. This concludes the first module of this two-part series that presents information on the co-occurrence of IPV and child maltreatment. The second module will center the goals, structure, and effectiveness of batterer intervention programs mentioned in this module and how these interventions are important to child welfare needs and goals. Please do not hesitate to reach out with any questions or interest to continue the conversation in relation to these topics. The last slides present the references that were used to create this module. Thank you for watching.